Bienvenidos a todos. This is the Paseo podcast. It is January 29th, but again, that doesn't really matter because it's a podcast. We're just happy you're listening to this whenever, wherever you are, whether that be wherever you're streaming your podcasts or on YouTube. We have a very special guest with us today. We have Daniela Velázquez. She is a senior public relations strategist at the PR firm Elasticity, a community advocate, and a proud Missourican. Daniela, welcome to the Paseo podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Oh, super
Um,
happy to have you.
yeah, super excited to be here and just share my story about, one Missouri, Kenya, a Missourican living in the diaspora, the beautiful diaspora of the Midwest.
Right on. Cool. Well, speaking of your story and being here, I know we're going to get into a lot of ground here, but let's start off with what our audience should know about you. What should they know? Give us the lowdown.
It's sort of like growing up in St. Louis and being Puerto Rican. It's like I've been super exoticized and like, oh, what is that? Where are you from? Are you a citizen? What are those big bananas you eat?
Hmm.
True story. But but
Gosh.
really like my family story is, I mean, it's so common. Both my parents were born in PR. My mom was born in Aguadilla. My dad was born in Mocha. And my mom moved to New York when she was 3, and my dad moved when he was 12, and that's where they met. They're in their 70s, so it legit, and how I explain it in St. Louis, was like West Side Story. A little bit. It was that time, and that's also kind of how I have to explain it to St. Louisans. Oh, I've seen that movie. Okay, do you dance? Kind of, but
Oh,
not in the alleys.
oh my gosh.
Yeah, and so my dad got a job with Western Electric, which is AT&T back in the day, and they moved to St. Louis in 1969 when the arch was fresh and it was this gateway to, the West. And my parents were like, let me get as far away from West Side Story in Brooklyn as we can into this American dream. And they moved to the far suburbs of St. Louis. And when I say that like people really didn't know like what Puerto Rico was, or I mean, you think they don't know what it is now, but St. Louis in the 60s and 70s, I mean, my parents got asked questions like, are you citizens?
Hmm.
Do you know how to make tacos? Which my mom does, but they're kind of Puerto Rican tacos. Yeah, and that's how they ended up here. And so, I'm the youngest of 4. First 2 siblings were born in New York, and then me and my other brother were born here. And like I grew up in, the essential, quintessential American dream in a suburb of St. Louis called Baldwin, which, fun fact, looked up the 1990 census records, and there were 24 Puerto Ricans in Baldwin. 24.
Okay, that's 24 more than I thought there were.
Well, our house was 6. So
Okay, oh,
like
there you go.
so I kind of always felt that we were different, but when I looked up that stat, I was like, okay, no, that was real. We were a
Yeah.
quarter of the population of Puerto Ricans in this suburb where I grew up.
Wow.
Um,
So you had, when we were talking about getting you on the show, you had mentioned your story of growing up Missourican was actually included in a book, and I have the title here: "Radical, an Unapologetic Anthology by Women and Gender Nonconforming Storytellers of Color." If you'd like our conversation with Daniela, definitely go check out that book.
you can buy it on Amazon.
You could buy it on Amazon. You had touched on a couple of things where you had said, people asking you if you can dance, do you eat bananas, a lot of these little microaggressions that I think a lot of people listening are familiar with, have experienced. But I'm curious to hear from you, like growing up in Missouri, growing up in St. Louis. Do you have any stories or a story that you can share about the challenges you faced growing up in the state?
Yeah, so it's funny because I was part of this book and a part of this. I'm going to do a little plug for Roots, Wounds, Words, which is this really great writers workshop, and they have classes, and they're for uh, BIPOC folks, and changed my world. But it kind of forced me to like dig into some of my culture, and that's sort of what I've been diving into this in this pandemic even more, and just like really reflecting. And so for you know people who don't know, St. Louis is a very, very black and white town. Literally, figuratively, some of the highest health disparities, racial disparities in health and income. And, we are a case study in white flight. All of this is reflected in St. Louis. So growing up, there's a very small Puerto Rican population. So it's about 5,000 in the whole metro area. I think the whole metro area is a couple million. Hispanics, Latinos, Latines, Latinx were about 4% of the overall region's population. And so living in St. Louis and growing up in St. Louis, it's really a matter of like, are you Black and are you white? And if you're not one of those, I'm very confused about where you fit into my paradigm, because I don't know anything else. So I've had moments where I'm fairly light-skinned, super fairly light-skinned in the middle of a pandemic because I have not seen sun. So it's always been a mix of like, depending on where I'm from, who sees my name, how dark I am at that moment. It's really like people's perceptions. And so like growing up, it was always like this, like, in the summers, I remember like I've been called racial slurs, like only because people don't know what I am. But also, what I wrote about in the essay was there was this moment I had when I was really young. I was actually really young, being kindergarten. And, my name is Daniela. And there is no silent A that exists in the English language. And I remember getting my name on the board, always a communicator, so I was always talking in class. And she had misspelled my name. And she'd spelled it with 2 L's. And I was like, hey, kindergarten teacher, that's not my name. Like, I don't know whose name you're writing for. And she like went back to her grade book, like looked it up and then like erased it and then like, spelled it right. And I just had this moment of like shame. And I remember growing up so many times thinking, correcting people about my name. I mean, not even getting to my last name, my first name. And now I think it's funny, and I've had to unpack it, but also in the essay I talk about this moment where I ran for, I don't know, like student council something president in 7th grade, and I was precocious and, probably too punny for my own good. And so my slogan was vote for the name you can't pronounce. Which I thought,
that'll get people's attention.
I still think it's genius.
Yeah.
I feel like the white kids in the vanilla conservative they did not get it. I did not win.
Oh, boo.
But looking back at it, I was like, oh yeah, that probably says a lot about like assimilation and how I perceive myself. So just, constant things like, all the examples I've named were like true stories. Like, wasn't your dad a citizen? Does he have a green card? And just, constantly being like, well, I don't fit in necessarily. We're not Black and we're not white. And in St. Louis, that often leads to some white privilege. Legitimately, because people don't know what you are. So if you're not Black, then you're white, even though that totally negates the whole history of Puerto Rico.
Yeah. So really sorry you didn't win your campaign in school. That's definitely a hit. But understandable if you're going to school with a lot of white people. They're probably going to want to have somebody in power that looks like them. That's a generalization, but if history has told us anything, that's most likely true.
7th grade, yes.
But I am curious. You mentioned looking up the census records when you grew up in St. Louis, and that there was 24 Boricuas, and that your family accounted for a quarter of that. What about now? Like, what's the Puerto Rican community like now where you live? Has it grown? Do you feel like it's substantial enough where you kind of have people that share that same identity and culture as you, or is it still kind of minimal?
So it's funny. I just want to bring up a story because you asked.
Oh, please.
And we're talking about like assimilation. Was that, I think it's part of being in the diaspora and not being in places where you're taught your history, you have access to your history, or you're intentionally not taught your history.
Yeah.
And I remember, I'd spell my last name And I'd be like, my last, Velázquez, like easy. Get it? It's not easy to spell. Wah, wah.
Mm,
And
mm-mm.
like then I got older and I was like, why do I have to acquiesce to this? Why am
Yeah.
I trying to make people comfortable? Like, you
Mm-hmm.
should know how to spell my name. Again, obsessed with the name thing.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, comparatively for people listening, here in Illinois, we have over 200 or 201,000 Boricuas. Now, that's pales in comparison to New York, which is like over a million. I think Florida is like nipping at New York's heels. Like they're over a million as well. So they might end up becoming the mecca of Boricuas here of the Puerto Rican community here in the United States. But looking at Missouri's numbers, you're talking about, I want to say, like 15,000, a little over 15,000 Boricuas that live. I mean, as of like the most recent data we've seen over the past
And
few
that's
years.
state. I mean, that's
Right.
not even Louis. Like that's, as we would say in St. Louis, everybody. That's like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, like you think of the geography there. I mean, yeah, that's throughout the whole friggin' state. So, it's a pretty substantial number, but nothing on the levels of like what we see in Florida, New York. I mean, even California. Let's talk about your work in public relations. So right now you're working for Elasticity. I do want you to tell us a little bit about what that firm is all about, what they do. But first, I wanted to just get a sense from you, like being a Boricua in Missouri, in St. Louis. What drew you to public relations? Why the magical world of communications?
I've always been a storyteller. Back when I was a kid, I wanted to be either a roller skating rock star, a journalist, or one of those activists on like Greenpeace's. Like I want to like hang off the ship of like Green, like
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The signs on the little raft. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I was
Yeah.
like totally and that's why I went into journalism. And I wanted to, as idealistic as it is, make the world a better place. And then I found myself having left journalism and back in St. Louis that there was a path that was like communications and advocacy. And so when I moved back here, I started my own communication shop sort of accidentally. And I was a staffer, a staff consultant for the Ferguson Commission because I moved right. I moved into St. Louis in May of 2014. And of course, Michael Brown was killed in August. Did some work, did some civic engagement work for the commission, did some consulting work for a group called the Mosaic Project, which part of the economic development partnership here in St. Louis that wanted to make St. Louis the fastest growing place for foreign born people by 2020. That's a mouthful, but that's what their slogan was and their goal was. And so I found myself in this place, in this kind of intersection of how can I build that bridge, right? Like, because it's, and I wish I could say it better in Spanish. I'm hoping saying it right. The ni de aquí, ni de allá, like never really fitting in anywhere,
Yeah.
not here, not there. And so, as personally kind of, as personally, I don't want to say daunting, but as personally trying as that may be, it has also served me well in a professional capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I have empathy. I know the other. I'm often the other. I can relate to the other. In a city that's black and white, let's be honest here. I'm light enough to be appeasing and not scary to white people, but I'm also not white, and so I don't have a brown pass, but there is some sort of openness to that because I'm not white, right? And if you look at the history of Puerto Rico and oppression, like I'm not. But I also understand what it's like being the other. So I've been able to, I did that, work for the ACLU of Missouri for about 3 years as their director of communications, and then came on to Elasticity, which is a full service digital PR firm. We do it all from paid media to public relations to, ads, the whole thing. But have really been able to, I feel like I've built my career on what I'm interested in, right? Because I know it's like, how can I help people understand as somebody who honestly feels misunderstood most of the time?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can I feel like it's given me, I've been able to ask those questions and like even just see the frustration and be able to have empathy in a way that helps move things forward and like ask questions that people don't always ask, or just being that squeaky wheel like, hey, that doesn't make sense. Hey, did you think about, are we, representing the population we're trying to serve?
Mm-hmm.
And so even at a public relations firm or an agency, I have, I manage a pretty broad set of accounts that are between, corporate to government to have a regional theater. And, I find myself asking those same questions about equity, about inclusion, about diversity, about representation, about, you know, thinking about people who are often overlooked all the time. Um, and so why it's a little bit of a weave between the things I've done, I feel like the core is always the same. Like it's still, from one storyteller to another, like if I can make you human and I can get you to not see me as the other, then maybe I can get you to love my thy neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself, and see things differently and maybe do things differently.
So for people listening, I'm just thinking of like maybe aspiring PR pros, or people that are thinking about, oh, maybe is the agency life for me? Is the communications world for me? Like, can you give us a little insight into just generally what is like the day to day? What's it like working at a PR firm?
So I was a journalist before this, and that is important, but not always necessary. But being in an agency is the most like being in a newsroom in my professional career that I've been. Everybody's a little crazy, everybody's a little creative, and no day is ever the same.
Nope.
And it is uncommon for clients to call you with slightly unreasonable requests at
Mm-hmm.
slightly unreasonable hours. And that's the charm, right? Like I worked in straight up corporate and I thought by my skill set that it was a good fit. And it wasn't, because I like the variety. I like the challenge of, you know, as you mentioned, or as I said, like I have I deal with nonprofit clients, I deal with for-profit clients, I deal with government clients. And it's a challenge and an intellectual challenge to think of like, how can I help them?
Mm-hmm.
And it changes. And I love that. And I also think too, doing PR, I want to see, and part of what I believe in, and sort of what has been foisted upon me, but I am learning to embrace, is you know being just doing what I do and being seen for who I am, because it helps other people see that they can do it too, right? And like I'll never forget this as a journalist example, and a microaggression. But remember when I was in Florida and I was working at the newspaper, I had a story in my name, like I had my byline, and some commenter was like, "Oh, Daniela Velázquez, she must be part of this affirmative action program, and it's really great that she speaks English so well." And I'm like, "Bitch, one, English is my first language. Two, I have a professional degree in journalism. Like, of course I speak, like, of course I have a command of the language. And like,
Yeah.
I know what I'm doing." I didn't say all that in the comment. But just by the fact that that happens, that
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
people who, it's like I can, I can go, and I have to take my full self wherever I go. Like that is, whether there's obligation, duty, love, it's kind of all of the above. Um, you know, that doesn't stop when I walk into a room, right? And I know that, like as a woman of color, all those things, like it is, I know that to some degree, as much as I want to ignore it, I know that I'm also walking into like stereotypes, and like I've got to like slay them at every moment I get, because I mean that's just the reality. And so, but being able to be that for other people, and being able to just be like myself, and also being imperfect, but also being like big hair and bright colors wherever I go in.
Seeing the level of organizing that is a multi-year effort to get Georgia to actually flip blue. So to have like 2 senators from Georgia, huge deal. Who would have thought that would be possible? So look, just for people listening, like to give context, like utilizing something like a PAC can really make or break the way a not only statewide office who sits in a position statewide or at the federal level for a state, but also in those smaller local elections. Like those make a big difference. How in the heck you got into political activism fascinates me because I love politics. I don't like the stickiness of it. I like seeing politics actually work and government actually work. But like, tell us a little bit about your story. Like, I know you've already told us a bunch, but of all the things to get involved in, like a PAC does demand a lot of time and a lot of organizing. Where do you find the time for that? Why did you want to get involved in something like a political action committee?
Yeah, I mean, so part of my path was before I came to the agency I was at, I was the director of communications at the ACLU of Missouri. Feel like you can't really get more political and or progressive than the ACLU.
ACLU's dope. Yeah.
And so I recently, I'm ending this fellowship called Chisholm's Chair. It's part of named after Shirley Chisholm. It's part of a group called We Power here in St. Louis. And the goal is to basically groom Black and Latinx women for, public office. So obviously, you can take the politics out. I don't know, I'm still a junkie, still love it, still want to see the change and still want to see how I can fit into it. So really, is just kind of a natural extension of that. Like I feel like that building bridge perspective has something to offer both my community and my people. As you know, in like PR and as in politics, money matters. Following the money matters. Money helps you be able to tell stories, hopefully not in Cambridge Analytica kind of way. But it's important, I think, to know, like, if you're going to be in the game, know how the game is played, right? And so for me, like getting involved with the PAC and getting involved with a group of Latinos that want to see representation across Missouri and understand the constraints of the political system, but also have the heart and the vision to see something else, is something I want to be a part of.
For any like people of color that are aspiring to get into the communications world or even currently practicing public relations, advertising, marketing, is there any advice that you have for people of color who want to get into the communications world? Like, what are some things they should keep in mind? Are there any things they should work on? Like, any words of wisdom that you have for those people?
Part of it I want to recognize, like, microaggressions, racism, sexism, it is real. Mm-hmm. And chances are, if you think you're experiencing it, you probably are. Yeah. Even though your boss may tell you that you're not. And I feel like this is a space to acknowledge that. I don't think, I don't want to deter people either. I think that there is that, again, it's finding the things that make you shine, that make your heart shine. And I know that's like cheesy and hippy dippy and like whatever. But I think that if you move from a place of values, it will reflect in your work. So if you're, we need more people, BIPOC people, telling our stories. We need more people saying, hey, that ad based on a cultural stereotype, probably not a good move. And certainly we need more people of those in places of power. So back to Shirley Chisholm and your folding chair. Part of it is moving past the point of representation into the place of decision making and having that power. And so I think continually acknowledging that you're not crazy, these things are happening. Not saying that they always happen, but they do. But also, like, if you lead from a place of courage and strength and love for the things that you do, the industry needs that. We started a multicultural practice at Elasticity that we've called Cultural, and it's really like a multicultural marketing firm. But the fact is, it's something like people of color make up a majority, more than 50 or 60% of the population, and only 6% of advertising spend is marketed toward people of color. So obviously, like right out the gate, you're starting off with that, right? So the gatekeepers, and same thing happened in news. They don't understand, or they're scared, or they don't know how to reach people. They're not putting the money there, right? So if we're thinking about equity, and we're thinking about equity in different industries, what does that look like? In PR and advertising, 60% should be a whole lot closer to 60%, right? And so what does that tell you about who's in power and who's making the decisions, who's making the budgets? And so this is probably not the question of why should you join, because now you're like, maybe I should pick a different career path. But I think the thing is there's opportunity there, and being equitable goes across industries, right? And it goes across like whose name you have on your boards. It really is, what are we doing or what are we not doing? And so like there is a more than compelling argument. I can give you the data, and you see it all over the place. You see it in advertising. You see it in these intersects of, like, I think about environmental racism and environmentalism, and like how environmentalism's always been like a very white thing, right? In these organizations, but who's really getting affected by, like, by pollution and dirty air? It's people of color, right? And so like to say that that environmentalism, because they don't feel like, because the people who've been involved haven't figured out a way to bring the other people in and the people that are most affected, doesn't mean that it's not, right? So I feel like if anything, there's a huge opportunity for people who care, and there's a big opportunity for people who want to make a difference, and there's a big opportunity for people to tell their story. And I feel like the world has changed. It is changing, but it has changed. And I feel like between 2016 and 2021, that we reached the tipping point where we can't return. What Black people in this country have always known about racism, the rest of the world is learning too, right? And even about PR, Maria, it's like, to explain Maria, you have to explain the Jones Act, right? And you have to explain colonization, and you have to explain what a territory protectorate, what anything you want a colony by any other name looks like, right? And so we're at the point where there's a hunger for the truth, and there's a lack of investment in the truth, and there are people who need to be there to help tell the truth. And I think that goes for as much as PR as it does for journalism, because the world has already shifted. So now we just have to be in those places to catch up.
Now, this is like going to be tough here. These are the rapid fire questions. I told you we asked the hardest of hardest hitting questions here on the Paseo podcast. Here we go. First question. What is your favorite type of music to dance to? And I know you said you're taking plena classes, so no bias, but what is your favorite type of music to dance to?
I hate to sound like totally like stereotypical, but I love those really fast merengues. Like those merengues, like you can't you're trying to be, is this a booty dance? Is this a merengue? My knees are hurting. I'm too young for this. Yes, those are my favorite.
Next question. I asked this I mentioned her earlier in our conversation, Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez. I asked her this, but for the Chicago area. So this is going to be for you in the St. Louis area. And I know there's not a lot of Puerto Ricans, but what is your favorite Puerto Rican restaurant to eat at in St. Louis, if it exists?
My mom's house, because it doesn't exist.
Mom's cooking is the best, though. Mom's cooking is best.
Although there is one Puerto Rican restaurant, the owner is not Puerto Rican, but they did make some really good. Though I know I don't want to smack talk.
Come on.
But I'm trying to yes.
Okay.
But it's good. The mofongo was good.
We'll leave it there. Okay, last question. This is a new segment. We've asked this a few times in a few interviews, recent interviews on the Paseo podcast. But we're asking people, like, what is something that you are obsessed with? Like something that you're reading, watching, listening to. If it's connected to Puerto Rican culture, awesome, but it doesn't have to be. As Puerto Ricanos, we can love all things from anywhere. But like, what are some things you're obsessed with right now?
Totally into novellas. Working on my Spanish on Rosetta Stone, and then Upping my yoke since I'm not powerlifting and I'm trying not to indulge my sweater body. I I've
I'm
re
guilty of that.
I mean it's hard not to. I've reignited my yoga practice and Puerto Ricanness. Um, I've actually started cooking some like traditional recipes, and I will tell you, I feel like the spirit of my ancestors are with me in the kitchen. But I love, as modern as I like things, I love a pibon.
Mm,
And there is nothing better than like the smell of like garlic and olive oil and salt,
yeah.
with the mortar and pestle. I've made flan twice in the past like month and a half. Um, I made pastelon.
How can people keep up with you? Social media, websites, give us all the things. How can they keep up with you?
All right, so you can check out Vos at vozkc.org. Um, you can check out um, my website is danielavelasquez.com. My email address is on there. I'm on Instagram, vdaniela and Twitter, vdaniela and on Facebook is Daniela Velázquez. So all the things, not on TikTok, thank goodness. Maybe I will with the Bomba Plana.
You should.
Um,
Why not?
it's been wonderful. It's been a lot of fun doing that. And yeah, I mean, on the internet, and super excited to keep connecting with people. This has been awesome and way surpassed my Twitter dreams. Um, I'm serious, like to be able to reconnect with people like through the diaspora
Mm,
and to, I think, always never feeling like I belonged anywhere,
mm,
but belonging everywhere and then realizing I'm not alone and
yeah.
that there are other people who have been, looking for themselves in the same way that I have been, and to reconnect over that is really powerful and also like really empowering.
Mm. Well, I can think of no better way than to end the podcast with that. I mean, Daniela Velázquez, thank you so much for spending time with us on the Paseo podcast. Appreciated having you.
Likewise, it's been great.